All right, so this week we're going to talk about the finding and colonization of to cover about this. We can't go through every single group of people or every single conquistador or any of that, but we'll cover a little bit of what happened and the legacy and the effect of the colonization of the Americas. So before original play, centuries-old trading system that linked Africa, Asia, and Europe. Uh, the elites wanted Chinese silk, porcelain. The Chinese wanted ivory and black slaves from Africa, and even exotic goods like peacocks from India. And African people wanted textiles and guns from India, guns from Britain, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. And as we will see, trying to find a route to India would lead to newly created global contact, new forms of cultural exchange, assimilation, conversion, and resistance. And we have to Columbus and others after him saw no contradiction between converting heathens and enslaving them, right? About the voyage's discovery. It had multiple causes. The first, we already talked about the economic and artistic revival of the Renaissance, but what that also did was cause a demand for luxuries, especially spices from the East. Now, why? Spices were introduced by the Crusades, and things like ginger, mace, cinnamon, and cloves added flavor to monotonous food. Could cure meat with salt. So everything you had, if you ever had meat, was very salty. Um, but you could also use spices in anointing oils, incense for rituals, as perfumes, medicines, daily life. So, take for example cloves. If you picked them green, then you would sugar them and you'd make it into jam. If you salted it, then you pickled it. It could be a flavor addition to the food that you're making. They sweeten the breath. They were thought to stimulate appetite and clear the intestines and bladder. When cloves were crushed, they were used as medicine, rubbed on forehead to relieve colds, and they were applied to eyes to strengthen your sight. Cloves were also taken with milk because it was supposed to enhance your sexual pleasures. So that just shows you all of the uses of cloves. These spices become so important and worth so much money that it is worth trying to find a way to end it. Voyage of discovery, there's religious fervor to this. It's an important catalyst that started again with the passion of, we talked about last week, reconquering the Iberian Peninsula, kicking the Muslims and the Jewish people out of Europe for the time being, created this, along with the Jesuits, like we talked about, created this fervor for new crusades, separated the conquest of Granada and Columbus's departure for the New World. Right. So this is in some ways a transfer of the spirit to non-Christian territories. We also have glory and the urge to chart new waters. Many have argued this glory was a manifestation of the Renaissance curiosity about the physical universe. It's to know more about the world Europeans had for the outside world. They're understanding that the world is round. They're understanding there are places that they do not know about. They obviously do not know that there's this huge piece of land that we call North and South America today, but they know there's stuff to be explored. And so individual explorers combine these motivations in unique ways. We'll talk more about Columbus. We won't talk about the other guys too much, just because it's well out of our. If you want to do a PowerPoint presentation on the conquistadors, is what they're called, that would be an interesting one. Come up with a question about them. So Columbus, a devout Christian, who really was haunted by messianic obsession in the last years of his life. He was a true believer, without question. Ptolemy Diaz put it pretty succinctly that his own motives were to, quote, to serve God and his majesty, to give light to those who were in darkness, and to grow rich as all men desire to do. Right? That's why he's going out and trying to conquer. Vasco da Gama landed in Calcutta, India in 1498, what he wanted, and he replied, I want Christians and I want spices. Conquistadors, just as he was about to conquer Mexico and the Aztec people, I have come to win gold, not plow the fields like a peasant. Right, so those are all kind of degrees as to why these men went and did what they did. Now the crews, they were basically ordinary soldiers. They were ill paid, and life at sea meant danger, overcrowding, and hunger. So it's not all, being a pirate and etc. It's very romanticized. It was dirty. It was, lack of vitamin C, all kinds of bad things. 100 to 200 people lived and worked in a space of about 1,600 to 2,000 square feet, right? A lucky sailor would find enough space on the deck to unroll his sleeping mat, but it's not just people who are on these ships coming from from old world to the new, but there were horses, cows, pigs, chickens, rats, lice, and as one person put, the most uncomfortable and oppressive experiences in the world. So why would you do that? Men chose to join these miserable crews to escape poverty at home, maybe to continue in the family trade, or just to try to find their lives as illegal immigrants in the colonies. And these are guys who just have nothing to lose. Like Bob Dylan says, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. Many were orphans and poor boys who were placed on board to do work and had little say in the decision, right? They basically kidnapped and made to work. Excuse me. So women also paid a price because they were left alone for months or years at a time, and they were frequently widowed. So they struggled to feed their families. The widow of a sailor, for example, who was lost at sea in 1519, had to wait almost 30 years to collect her husband's salary from the crown. But at the same time, the tales of voyages were eaten up by the people at home of exotic places and unknown peoples. And one of the most popular books at the time, which was basically, like your Harry type book, of Sir John Mandeville, which purported to be a first-hand account of travels in the Holy Land, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Middle East, and India. And so in this book, which we know to be absolutely fake today, he talks about his service to the king of Egypt, and the great Mongol Kong, and these fantastic tales of cannibals and one-eyed giants and men with heads of dogs, audiences that these things existed. In fact, Columbus took this and the travels of Marco Polo on his voyages in 1492. So let's talk a little bit about Columbus. So Columbus, he's a controversial figure in history because he is glorified by some as a courageous explorer, which there is no question that he was. He was basically setting out to do something that they had no knowledge of, right? And he's vilified by others as a cruel exploiter of Native Americans. Many also question how he could have quote unquote discovered, given that millions of people were already in the Western Hemisphere, and that the Vikings probably landed in Newfoundland in the 1100s. But it is important to understand him from his own time. Firstly, we have to ask, what kind of man was he, and what forces or influences shaped him? And sailing westward, what were his goals? And thirdly, did he achieve those goals, and what did he make of his discoveries? Dream of a westward path. He embodied this long-standing, and he's Italian, by the way. He's not Spanish, but the Spanish pay him to go find a way to India. He embodies this ambition to circumvent the globe, to go all the way around and to circumnavigate the globe, excuse me, and then also to circumvent the Venetian domination of the East, right? Which was then starting to be dominated by the Portuguese, and so the Spanish to get their hand in the spice market. And for Columbus, it's kind of a regional pride. He wants Genoa, Italy, to become this trade hub for the spices, as opposed to. He was knowledgeable about the sea. He had worked as a map maker, and he was familiar with navigational developments and the use of the compass. As he asserted in his journal, quote, "I have spent 23 years at sea and have left it for any length of time worth mentioning. And I have seen everything from east to west," meaning he had probably been to England, "and I have been to Guinea, which is North and West Africa." So he'd kind of been around Europe and their close neighbors. Um, but there is no question that his successful voyage to the Caribbean owed a great deal to his seamanship. He was an explorer and he was good at his job. He was also deeply religious. He witnessed firsthand the conquest of Grenada, and he shared fully in the religious and nationalistic fervor that surrounded that event, the kicking of the Muslims out of Europe. Like the Spanish rulers and most Europeans of the era, he understood Christianity as a missionary religion that should be carried to all places of the earth. Uh, he really viewed himself as a divine agent. He also wrote in his diary, "God made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth of which he spoke in the Apocalypse of St. John, and he showed me the post where to find it." Right? So he is a true believer. Now, what was the object of his first voyage? Well, he gave the title of the expedition Indies. So he was trying to find a direct route to Asia, and he was rejected by both the Portuguese and Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish monarchs, earlier, but he finally won the backing in 1492 with his argument that I want the market instead of the Portuguese, and I am a true believer. And Ferdinand and Isabella were very religious as well. So with his zeal and his argument, he won them over in 1492. And also, the king and queen promised him he would be viceroy or governor over any territory he might discover, and they also promised him 1/10 of all the material rewards. And talked about it. He dreamed of reaching the great Khan's court. Uh, Interestingly enough, he didn't realize that the Ming Chinese and establish. But what he expected was to pass the Japanese islands and then land on China's east coast. So the next question is how did he interpret what he had found? And in his mind, did he achieve what he had set out to do? So he leaves on August 3rd, 1492, and he lands in the Bahamas on October. And that's this top red route that he made there. He believed he was in Japan, and he gave the natives some beads and other small trifles, and then pronounced them to be delighted with the gifts and eager to trade. In a letter he wrote back to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, he calls the natives handsome people, peaceful, painting. And believing himself to be in the Indies, he calls them Indians. He also says that they would be good slaves and they could be easily converted to Christianity. Scholars now know the people he first met as the Taino people, who were speakers of the Arawak language, or the Dominican Republic and Haiti today, and other islands in the Caribbean. He understood through hand gestures that he thought there were positive signs of gold and the presence of a great king. So he really did think he was still in Japan. So he sailed southwest, thinking that this would either take him to southern Japan or even he would land on China. Instead, on October 28th, he landed in Cuba, deciding that he must be on mainland China, near what is now called the large city of Hangzhou, which he obviously was far, far from China. He sent a small embassy inland with letters from and asking for instructions on how to find their great Khan. But what the people he sent around were villages, and confronted with this disappointment, he gave up his aim to meet the Khan. He kind of had a feeling or an understanding that he wasn't in the right place. So then, instead, he focused on finding gold because the Thais were wearing gold necklaces. So that seemed to prove there was much to be had. So in January, he heads back, January 1493, he heads back to Spain, confident that the men he left on the island would um, find the source of the gold. So that is kind of the idea of Christopher Columbus. So over the next decades, the Spanish would follow with a policy of conquest and colonization, rather than one of an exchange with equals. They will not treat the indigenous peoples as equals. Now, on a second voyage back, uh, Columbus forcibly subjugated Hispaniola and enslaved its indigenous peoples, and thus creating the slave market for sugar plantations. He brought with him this time settlers, so he knew that he was going to come back for conquest, along with agricultural seed and livestock. However, he had little skills in governing, and a revolt broke out against him and his brother. And a royal expedition from Spain was sent to investigate, and it returned with the Columbus brothers in chains. He was given a trial in Spain. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. Excuse me. Territories remained under royal control. And so he will make a couple voyages back, eventually dying basically a poor man. But is that Columbus was very much a man of his times. To the end of his life, which in 1501, he had a feeling that he wasn't where he wanted to be, but he still believed that he had found some type of small islands off the coast of Asia. He understood that he did not make it to China, but he didn't completely comprehend what he had actually found for the Europeans. He never realized the scope of his achievements to have found a vast continent unknown to Europeans, except for a fleeting Viking presence centuries earlier. He had no idea he died well before he knew the scale of his discoveries that would revolutionize world power, politics, trade, settlement, government bureaucracy, and so change the lives of millions of the follow once Europeans dominate the Americas. So, real briefly, let's talk a little bit about the indigenous people whom the Europeans meet. The first ones are the Incans, and here is a map of the Inca Empire. It was never an empire like the Spanish assumed, but it was a confederation of tribes composed of clans. Now, each tribe had its elders, but it was very centralized under control of the royal family. They believed in the sun god they worshipped, and Inca means ruler and descended from God. The emperor or the elder of the Inca Empire sometimes married his sister. Concubines' offspring were usually royal family. They were called children of the sun. And the authority of the royal family rested on military and religion. So this is a centralized society, but it's also a society really clannish as well. Their agriculture really was the triumph of will and energy over nature. When the Spanish got there, they found the Incas had cut through solid rock and created steep inclines in an area tilled agriculturally that is larger than it is even tilled today. So this is a vast empire that's centralized, that's agriculturally relevant. Potatoes, alpaca, llama, uh, because the alpaca and llama were used for meat, hides, and wool. They had pottery, textile, metalwork, and they were builders. My apologies. Excuse me. Very much akin to ancient Romans. The Spanish found Cuzco was a mammoth and they had raised walls that were built so perfectly they did not use mortar. They had roadways, which unfortunately for the Incas, the Spanish are going to use to conquer them. But they had roads, they had bridges, tunnels, they had aqueducts, very Romanesque type society, and they had a great postal system. Because they had these roads and they linked these roads to their postal system. There are evidence of people who are of their skeletons that they had brain surgeries called trepanation. But what the Incas did not have is writing. And they also, their society was also kind of based around what people call agrarian communism today. Um, it's very rigid. It's the most rigidly structured ever to be found. Actually, it was really a top down. There was the ruler, then the tribe, then the clan leader, right? So basically three leaders, and they being and grouped at the bottom, excuse me, of just the regular people would be grouped in groups of 10. It's very totalitarian, but in theory, it's also promoting general welfare. And it's a cooperative, very much what we would consider to be communistic. Land was owned by the government and distributed periodically and equitable, and you worked under the eyes of supervisors. So you had your group of 10 who you worked with all of the time, your super group of 10. And then that supervisor listened to the king, and then the king would distribute land periodically and equitable, and so all of these things are very much working for the state. Any surplus crops or manufactured articles they stored in public warehouses, wool too, and they shared these things cooperatively. They were released in times of scarcity, but it appears that both private property and freedom of choice were quite minimal. Occupations were hereditary, and all able-bodied persons performed their tasks. So the idea is that this equals high productivity, full employment, care for the aged and the infirm, and low crime. This is like Marx's dreams, right? Karl Marx's dreams that we talked about earlier. But it's security with little freedom. And this will very much explain why they get conquered so easily. Well, not easily, but they get conquered in the end, because the conquistadors realize that if you can take out the head of the snake, it's kind of that. You get the head off the snake, the other part's going to die, and that's the emperor. Now, on the other side of a little north of them, in what we would probably consider to be Central America today, was the Mayan civilization, and they were high development of indigenous peoples in the Americas. They settled on the Gulf Coast plain here, then in Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula, and by the 12th century they were a dominant force. By the time the Spanish get there in the 16th century, they had lost their luster. but they did bring quite a bit to the table. Their genius lay more in intellectual and artistic fields rather than technology and building like the Incas. They obviously, what we know them for is the calendar. They had kept very accurate, and they would inscribe these in stone pillars. And it's interesting to note almost all indigenous people had a way to tell time. The Toltecs used a solar calendar with a 365-day year and provision for an extra one every fourth year. Sound familiar? Uh, but the Mayans went beyond in complexity, sophistication, and mathematical symmetry. They were fascinated with the phenomenon of time, and they sought to correlate, quote unquote, celestial time, or the movement of the heavenly bodies, right, the sky, with quote unquote terrestrial time, or historical human events that are happening on Earth, right? It's kind of the space and Earth idea. And their calendar was more accurate than the Europeans' 100 when Pope Gregory III, and we get on the Gregorian calendar. But for thousands of years, the Mayans were more accurate with their calendar and astronomical data than any of the European civilizations were. The calendar also, what they used it for, it's a library of information combining rituals, mythology, historical narrative with seasonal and astronomical data. And from a fixed date, which was 3113 BC. From that date, they were able to determine individual days in any year, counting backward or forward. So this is like a single inscription. So what you can do with that is you can name the exact day or night of any event, and you can correlate that with planetary phases, the age of the moon, eclipse periods, and other phenomena. So not only is their calendar accurate, what that does is allow them to keep very accurate records and very good histories. They also had place notation, or the number 0, which gave them ability to record enormous amounts of precise data in a limited space. Using the concept of 0 and the decimal system, they assigned a particular value to each space on a column of figures. So it's kind of analogous to something like the abacus to a calculator type of idea. So by just several parallel rows on a chart, they can convey exact notions of quantity, duration, or rank without needing a large number of symbols. Right, so they're using symbols, but symbols take time and energy, and they take up space. The Mayans are putting a lot of data in a small area because of place notation. And I'll show you a picture, excuse me, in the next slide. They were not the only indigenous with numbers and writing, but they were the only ones who developed the notational system so that calculations could be recorded in red. So they got writing by learning how to depict speech. So it's pictographic in origin, and so they had some 600 characters, and I'll show you some pictures of their writing as well, of which about 10% represented spoken sounds or objects. So they made illuminated books with characters written on deerskin and paper made from plants that were indigenous to the Americas. And it still has not been completely deciphered. Excuse me. And the Spanish destroyed a lot of it, but there are some codexes that are found today, and I'll show you what I'm talking about on the next slide. So here are two examples of the the Incas' ingenuity. On the left, building that you can see is like a fort, so to speak, right? You can tell. But it's on the cliff. It's got high walls. You can see everything from this vantage point. But you can tell this is an advanced society. And on the right is what is called terrace farming. And you can this was created by the Incas, and it still exists today. Is this idea of farming on these really high slopes by terracing it and irrigating from the top to the bottom, right? So they're making use of the land. Unbelievable capabilities of building. It should also be the Spanish brought over horses and oxen. There were no horses or cows in the Americas, and Spanish brought them. So they're building all of this completely human labor, completely. Here's a little bit of the Mayan. On the left is a calendar, and you can see that it's not only a calendar, but there's obviously dates and historic records and time and all of these things put in there. And then on the right is what's called the Dresden Codex, and this is some of those have seen it's kind of pictographic, but it's in some places as well, and you can tell that there are some this is place notation down here using these are numbers, and this is place notation right here, right? You're using lines and dots to number things and count things like this, right? This is how they counted. The idea of place notation. And then when we look on our next and just the Mayan ingenuity, that's kind of a look at one of the more centralized agrarian building communities or civilizations that the Spanish ran into. Intellectual side of things, we won't really be able to discuss the Aztecs, but in the next PowerPoint presentation here, on your next slides, we'll see a little bit of when I went to Belize and saw some Mayan ruins, and then we'll also talk about what happens once the Spanish and the Portuguese get to the Americas, and they really start being serious about colonization and conquering.